The Developer Toolbox. Anybody that's gone out and done any skilled labor of any sort, whether you're an electrician or general contractor or plumber or any of that kind of stuff, we have this picture of them with a toolbox. I mean, a literal physical toolbox, and it may have wrenches, it may have screwdrivers, it may have paint and paint brushes, depending on what their job is. They've got a bunch of tools that's what they do. They use those. And as you watch these people over the years, like maybe the entry level plumber, the guy that's just getting started, their toolbox is not going to be the same as the one that's been doing it for 20 or 30 years, because you accumulate tools as you go. You try a few things out, and early on, maybe all you know how to do is, maybe you only can use a hammer and saw. But then later on, you figure out, oh, I need a square, or I need whatever else. Yeah, I need a screwdriver, I need a drill, I need all of these other things and all of the different variations of those tools. Well, software development's really not that much different. We have tools that we need to use or can use. And I think a lot of the problem that we run into early on is there's a lot of tools at our disposal we don't use, particularly these days, because with the internet where it's at, there are just an incredible amount of tools out there that are free or close enough to free. And particularly if you are a developer, there's a lot of stuff out there that they're commercial products, but there's a developer version that allows you to do pretty much everything you want to do, and in some cases is exactly the same as the full-blown paid enterprise version. The only restriction they put on you is that you can't turn around and use it in professional development. But if you're doing stuff on the side, if you've got your little project that you're working on, you're free to use this. And with a lot of them also, the pricing is either free or close to it based on a single user. If you've got 10 or 15 or 20 users, then suddenly the prices are going to start going up possibly dramatically. But if it's just you, sometimes it's they have the free /developer/solo account or option that you can do that makes it a good excuse for you to go add that tool to your toolbox. When you're thinking about the toolbox that you have, the first thing to think about is that to understand is that developers do a lot more than code. Now, you may be a head-down coder type person, but particularly as you get further into your career, that's going to change. And even when you're a heads-down coder, there's a lot of stuff that we do that is actually not directly writing code. There's a lot of things that we do around it that's, even the simple things like compiling the code, debugging the code, adding comments and version control and things like that. So there's a lot more than just writing code. One of the things that we find as we become better developers is that communication is a key part of our job. We're either communicating with our manager, our team, customer maybe, users, ourselves even. So a lot of tools, there's a lot of communication tools that I don't think, they're either just there and we use them, we don't consider them as tools, or we actually don't use them and we just don't think about it. We're like, I'll just use, maybe email when there are maybe better options out there. There's also tools, of course, that are going to help us code better. Like the debugger that I've mentioned a couple of times, those kinds of things that are, you can sit there and write in a straight text editor and write your code and you can be okay doing it, but there's a lot of ways to improve your productivity. Along those same lines, you want to be able to, it is incredibly valuable to be able to track your changes and to be able to have a history and to be able to essentially roll back, not just as a team, but individually, to be able to go down a path for a while, working on code, and then realize, oh, wait, I didn't really want to do that. Or, wow, I just got myself way off track. I need to go back where I was about 4 or 5 hours ago because I've really just wasted this time going down a rabbit trail. Well, if you can track your changes, that's going to make that a lot easier. One of the things that I've only run into once or twice in a lot of years with a junior developer is one that keeps up a journal or documents their work as they go. Like the idea of a blog. Sort of originally, that was the idea of a blog, was almost that you would just, sort of spew at the end of the day what you'd done, keep track of sort of what you were working on, maybe some problems you solved, things like that. Mostly, maybe to share with others, but also for yourself. Now, as developers progress and become, mid-level and senior level and beyond, you'll see that more often, because we just have a lot of stuff that we've gone through, and we want to be able to track what is it that I was doing 5 years ago, because sooner or later you're going to find out that stuff, it does resurface. And so if you solve that problem a year or 5 years ago, if you've got a good journal or some documents to point you back to it, you don't have to do as much work. You can basically build off of whatever that effort was before. And finally, there's a lot of administrative tasks, simple things like your weekly status, but all sorts of other things around having a development environment, maintaining a development environment, and maintaining all of these tools and all of this work that you're doing, all this content, whether it's source code or your journal related content that you're creating as you go. So we're going to look at 8 common families of tools. We'll say that these are all things that you as an individual developer should have at least an opinion about. Preferably you've got a tool in each of these areas that you're comfortable with. And we'll talk about these as we get a little deeper, what it actually means to be comfortable with these tools. But each of these these are areas that we as developers are probably going to be touching them at least once a week, probably more often than that. And so they become really useful for us to be productive. If you're doing something several times, if there's a tool that helps you do it faster, then obviously, it's the more you do it, that little savings is going to add up. The 8 are, as you can see here, just editors or IDs, integrated development environments, debuggers and those related tools, issue tracking, a document repository, version control, group communication, mail clients, and then database tools or database IDEs. Let's start with, of course, an integrated development environment. Now, this is probably going to be driven by your main coding language. So if you're a C# developer, you're probably going to be working with Visual Studio. That's just sort of the way it works. If you're in a specialty language like Salesforce's, I think it's ForceScript that they call it, or NetSuite, or some of these others that have their own little sort of integrated environment, you're going to be stuck with that. But there also are some really good language neutral environments out there, or at least by default they're language neutral, and then you can customize the living daylights out of them to work with whatever your desired language or languages are. And I'm thinking about things like, in particular, Eclipse and IntelliJ, and some of those that are built really to be a neutral, and even NetBeans, although these all had different starting points, mostly around a Java, but they've got so many plugins now that you can do just about any language you can think of. These are editors that can do that for you. And that's actually an awesome way to choose an integrated development environment, is to find one that has the ability to grow and stretch to whatever languages and whatever environments you need to work in, because then you've got you've always got a comfort level. You've got this application that you can fire it up, and you know how to edit files, you know how to save stuff, you know where all their default stuff is. You can work preferences all day long, so you can get the colors right and the fonts right and all of those things that can make your development and coding experience that much more comfortable. And you think about it, if you're staring at a screen and you're writing code 8 hours or more a day, then it does make sense to spend that time to have like fonts and sizes and arrangements and layouts that work for you. And it may not work for the guy next to you, but that's okay. They can do their own thing. This is for you because you might as well get comfortable and settle in when you're writing your code. And so something can grow is going to be very helpful to you, because then you don't have to learn a whole bunch of different tools. Although I do recommend that you at least play around with a couple different IDEs, particularly popular, well-known ones. So if you end up in a situation where you're at a company that's what they ask you to use, you can at least jump in and use it to some extent. I don't think I've been in anywhere that's really mandated that I use a particular IDE, but what you'll find is that depending on different areas and different companies and different lines of businesses, you'll find that most of the developers use one particular IDE or another. And if you go with the group, then you're probably going to be a little easier to integrate with them and be able to get, learn some tricks and tips and tricks from them via osmosis, basically. Learning some of those shortcuts and things that will make you better with that IDE. Outside of an IDE, it's also useful to have, because IDEs are usually going to be sort of fat and a little bit slow to load up because they've got a lot of features. It's usually really helpful to have an editor that's powerful, but lighter weight, that's really like almost like a pure editor. Ultra Edit is used by a lot of people. And this is stuff that you're going to need. You're not necessarily going to be writing like, if you're C programmer, C++ or Java or any of those, you're not going to be writing like your full application, but you may use this editor to quickly like edit an HTML page or bring up an XML document. Or a lot of times I'll find that you're working with really large files of some sort, whether it's a data export or dump that somebody's had you look at, or maybe log files, things like that are just pure, probably not terribly formatted text. So if you want to get, when you're picking that editor that you want to use, make sure it can support large files. And by large files, I'm talking probably minimum 20 to 50 meg files. But if you can get something that can load up a multi-gigabyte file, that helps a lot too, because that you will run into it. Not every day, depending on what your line of business is that you work in. But if you are in, like if you're in the banking industry, you may run into those kind of large files on a regular basis. Some of those ACH files can get huge. And so having something that can handle them is going to be very helpful to you. And just loading the file isn't enough. It does help immensely if you can view line numbers on a lot of those files so that you can quickly, work your way through a file. Or if you're discussing it with somebody else, you can say, hey, check out line number 4,572, and they can jump to that line number and they can see what you're seeing, as opposed to like having to count it out or search for a specific line or some of that kind of stuff that's just tedious and time consuming. Something that I think is overlooked a lot is the existence of macros. You'll have them in IDs on a fairly regular basis, but there's so many features you don't maybe need them as much. When you're talking about your straight up editor, then actually those become very helpful. I use macros numerous times over the years for doing things like if you're going through a log file, trying to maybe like replace certain data in there to clean it up, or to maybe to walk through and only grab certain, go to certain lines and delete everything else so that you can simplify it out. A lot of like search and replace type things that you need to do. You can also find this in you'll find like fixed length or even CSV files that are huge, where you want to go through and maybe you want to like capitalize the first letter after every comma or something like that. There's just those random kind of tasks that's just a lot of keystrokes, but it's a repetitive lot of keystrokes. And a macro is a lifesaver at that point. So not only do you want it to have it, spend a little time to understand how to create them, because they will make your life a lot easier. In an IDE, they're almost always going to have an integrated debugger to some level. If not, most languages now have got, depending on what what the language is, most of them have somewhere a visual editor or environment that has a nice visual debugger, or always go back to command line ones as well. Understand how to put the debugger on your application, whether it's whether you're debugging mobile app or a web app or a console application or GUI application, whatever it happens to be, whatever your environment is. You want to be able to work your debugger. You want to be, and with that, you want to be able to like set a breakpoint so that you can stop the code somewhere in there and look at what's going on, so that if things are broken, you can get to a certain point and say, okay, this is where it's broken. Let's look around at the data and the status of the code where I'm at. Of course, with that, you want to be able to have some sort of variable evaluation or insight or something like that. So when you get to your breakpoint, you can go see, well, there's variable X. What does the code think the value is for variable X at this point? And a lot of times your variable X is going to be something more complicated than just a little string or an integer. So having a good debugger that allows you to actually dig into that and see if X is a class, that you can see all of its properties and what its values are. You can see if it's null, that kind of stuff. Immensely valuable in debugging your code. And since we all write buggy code somewhere along the way, immensely value in becoming a better developer. Don't underestimate the ability to look at a stack trace, or at least see your position in the code. Once you get it, when you're writing simple applications, it's not that big a deal. But once you get into particularly object-oriented and then event-driven GUI type applications where you've got a lot of objects or a lot of controls, maybe a lot of source files that you're dealing with, the ability to see how I got to this breakpoint can often be a really key indicator is what's going on. You may see that, oh, wait, I didn't even go to this file that sets up a lot of stuff that I expected to already be initialized. And so you can make those changes around. Also get used to being able to use, whether you have to, because depending on what you're working with, a lot of times you're going to have a little bit extra work to either link in libraries, and particularly the source version of libraries or the debug version of libraries, so that you can actually see what's going on beyond just, oh, I'm in some third-party library. Particularly with mobile development, there's a lot of that kind of stuff where you've got your libraries that are the release versions that the source code is all stripped out, or they may be in the JavaScript world, they may be obfuscated or minimized so that it's really useless for you to read it human form. But there's a lot of times a way for you to tie it back and say, well, here's the obfuscated, zipped, whatever form of it, the binary form of the library. And I know that I've got over here the actual source for it. So it's able to actually point me to what that source code is that it's executing or trying to execute within that library. Everybody's favorite in the world, issue tracking and bug tracking. Now, this almost always is going to be the first time you're going to run into this. It's probably customer or employer mandated. Usually employer, because usually you're working for somebody else. They've already got an issue tracking system up there, and that's probably one of the first things you do in your first week or two on the job is they get you an account and you start working through the backlog of tickets or looking at support help desk tickets or whatever they happen to be. I highly recommend that you have a personal solution that you use, which is, it's as much a to-do list and idea tracker as anything, but getting comfortable with how bug tracking and issue tracking tools work, spending a little time researching the ones that are out there, understanding flow from creation of a ticket to working it, to resolving it, to testing it, to produce it, to deploying it, to kicking it out to production. And what happens if something goes to production and now I've got a bug and I have to reopen it? Just those kinds of things are great habits for you to work on. And so a personal solution, whether you go get download the free or the 10-time, I think it's $10 once ever. You can get Jira for a year, or you can go out to Mantis, or now there's so many tools out there. Even if it's just the built-in ones that Bitbucket and GitHub have, just using those and getting sort of comfortable with them is going to be very helpful as you go through your career, and you're going to bump up against, I'm sure, several of them, unless you, for some reason, are able to stick with a single employer. And even then, it's going to evolve over time. So something that was their great, awesome bug tracker that they used for 10 years suddenly just is worthless to them, and they have to upgrade and move on to another one. Now you can start simple and cheap. You can just use a little spreadsheet, something like that. Just, the key is just getting yourself in the habit of, hey, I've got tickets to work, getting used to like putting notes on those things, statuses, how old is it? How fast can I get stuff done? The more you can add like that, the better. If you get something that's got like a time tracker or something like that in it, it's going to be awesome because that's going to help you for your estimation kind of tasks that will come across. And that's hugely valuable. When your boss asks you, how long is it going to take you to do X? And you can give them a number, you don't have to give them a number immediately, but you can give them a number at some point where you say, hey, I'm going to take a look at it. And you come back and your estimates tend to be pretty close to on, plus or minus 10% even. You're going to be a rock star because they're going to be able to say, okay, Mike said it could be done in 2 days. He's going to get it done in 2 days. And that's all they need to worry about. That's huge for a manager or a team lead. In this world, like I said, issue tracking can be as simple as a spreadsheet. And because the barrier to entry to building an application for this is non-existent, there are a ton of free or dirt cheap options out there. You could build your own. Early on when I was working with, this goes all the way back to Handspring, not Spring, but Handspring, which is old, like first generation smartphone stuff. I was able to use, actually, I think it was J2ME. I used the ME version of Java and built a little bug tracking app for myself. So I had a little handheld bug track thing that I could, put some stuff in. It was not fancy in any way, but there's a way to keep track of stuff. And it's a nice little, side project to do. And one that helps you, forces you to think through a little bit. How does this stuff work? What do we really care about as far as a bug tracking tool? And you'll realize that, those free dirt cheap options, a lot of them are almost perfect. The ones that are very expensive and have all of these bells and whistles, unless you're doing, huge team development, a lot of that stuff is just, it's wasted. It's stuff that you don't really need. It is truly just bells and whistles. So why bother with it? And as you get into the upper levels of your career and you're in decision-making roles or you're recommending stuff, that's going to be awesome to have that kind of background so you can say, oh, look, here's some stuff that it may look great, it may cost a lot, but we really don't need it, and be able to back that up with some reason why. So there's value and experience with the high-end tools, but you're probably not going to run into them very often unless you're with, a very big company. And by experience, a lot of those you can get like a 30 or 60 or 90-day trial. You can play around with it, throw some bugs in there, some tasks, maybe track a project or two, maybe assign a resource or two just to get comfortable with it. So you can say, yep, here's roughly what it does. And then you can move on to something that's a little better suited for your own personal solution. Document repository. That may sound bigger than it is. And actually, as we get through there's a couple different flavors of this. And so as you get towards the end, it's probably going to be exactly what it sounds like to you. When I'm talking about a document repository, this is basically everything that you generate that's not code. Code ends up in version control, or at least it better. You hope it does. This is all of the other stuff you do, including notes, which hopefully you take them on a regular basis. If not, get used to it. And there's just too many things that go on in meetings and in your daily routine that it's useful to take notes. And this is including like all of the work that you do, that, whether you're setting up a specific configuration, whether you're creating some temporary user and password, whether you've got some couple server addresses that you need to get to, or folder locations and stuff like that. Just, so notes that you've got. There's also sort of a step up from that as like dynamic content, what would normally be in a wiki, which is more like your configuration type stuff, maybe server addresses and default directories, things like that, they're a little more static. They're more aimed at a bigger audience than just yourself, or they can be at least useful to people other than yourself. But it's stuff that you want to be able to read without having to like search all over the place. Notes tend to be a little less organized. This is a little bit more organized notes, essentially. And then moving up to like your cloud storage or full document, you definitely want to have those things. You want to keep track of that. It is hugely valuable to have like all of your old like design documents that you've been exposed to, and status reports, and white papers, and stuff that you've had to write up, whether it's you've had to research something, or whether you've had to recommend something, whether you had to write up some sort of a debugging process or some other process or procedure, whether you as a team created that, user documentation, technical documentations, you've had to create all of that stuff. Those kind of documents, you still want to store those. Cloud storage is awesome for that. And with those, there's like going to be templates that you've maybe used or built over the years. Plus, there's also going to be finished documents. So, status is a great example. If you've got a template that you use, or that like jumpstarts you doing your weekly status or monthly status or biweekly or daily, however it is, or like daily stand up, if you've got your little agenda or something like that, you've got a template that you can jump in, fill it out, and be done. That's awesome. But you also want to keep all of the old ones, because you want to have that history. You want to be able to look back. And it's the older I get, the more I go, the further I go into all these different projects and all these customers, the more I find the value in the history of stuff that I've done. I don't know how often I'll do something, or something will be thrown out at me, and I'll go, oh yeah, I remember working on that. We did something like that a year or two ago. And if I can go find those documents, or whatever the content is around that, then it makes it that much easier to get it done. So let's go a little deeper into some of these documentation types that I just talked about. First one is your notes, or your just scratch pad or something like that. Some of the stuff that you're going to want to have here, or that you probably do, but if not, think about keeping track of these things. Is any ideas, goals, quick capture stuff like, hey, I need this username and this password, or hey, what's the IP address for this server I'm going to hit? Or a lot of times keep track of like links to research material, or test servers, or configuration sites, or walkthroughs, things like that. With your note apps or your scratch type things, and it's assuming you can use pencil and paper, but digital is going to be much more useful, because you want it to be indexable and searchable. If I've got all these raw notes and I can actually do a search for, maybe a key phrase or a tag or something like that, it's going to be much better than having to flip through, books and books of notepads, or, stuff that I've got. And I say this as somebody that actually I like handwriting notes. It actually is sort of tedious and sort of a chore for me to type notes up. I would rather write them. But actually what I end up doing is I sort of do a duplicate entry a lot of times. Is I will write stuff down, and then I'll come back later and then put them into a note app. It's a little bit more organized, maybe a little bit more cleaned up as thoughts go. But it's still, really just sort of like Scratchpad and notes. But as you're doing this, it does help to have an app that allows you to have some sort of organization, whether that's like folders or notebooks, or like a page header, or title, something like that, or even books, I guess, if you want a scarier book. I'm not sure, kind of a little typo there. But doing something like that is going to be, again, it's just the more organization you have, the easier you can use it and search the data, the more useful it's going to be across, time, over the days, weeks, months, and years of your career. It helps to have multiple access points. Evernote is well known for good reason. It is an awesome note-taking app. You can, have it on your phone. You can have it on your tablet. You can have it on your desktop. You can have it, hit it out in the cloud somewhere, wherever you want. You can get to it. I'm not an Evernote backer or anything like that necessarily. I just say I do use it. I actually do the paid version, so I can sync stuff all over the place, and it is an awesome notes app. It is by far not the only one. There's some really cool ones out there, particularly in the last couple of years. It's an area that's grown. If you haven't decided, sort of landed on your own personal note or scratch app out there, do a Google search on it. You're going to find several of them, and find the one that suits you best. For wiki and dynamic content, there's a lot of stuff out there. I mean, WordPress, which we use, could actually be used really easily. Any of the content management systems out there like that. You want something that's pretty easy to use and pretty easy to access, because what you're going to do is you're going to have things like your processes. How do I, load this data? How do I export this data? How do I back up this stuff? How do I install this software? How do I configure this server? Those kinds of processes and best practices, and even coding standards and configurations. It's all of these things that you do them more than once. Usually by the time you get to the third or fourth time and you realize I need to document that somewhere, that's when you say, I need to put it on a wiki site of some sort. You can put it on a regular document, just throw it in a Word doc or Pages or something like that. But putting it out on the website, putting it in a wiki-based one just is that much easier. It's really easy you just hit the website. Again, much like the note stuff, you want something that's searchable. You want it to be organized in a way that you can, link it to projects or customers or folders or whatever their terminology is for organization. But you definitely want to be able to do that. In these wiki and dynamic content type applications, you want to be able to have this is a good place to store reference links. So if you're maybe you're learning Ruby, let's say. Well, this is a great way to have your learning Ruby page so that you've got maybe a couple of key places that you've got tutorials, some, built links to download the latest or find out the latest news. Those kinds of things are awesome in a wiki site, because then you can just edit it as you find new ones. You can just throw it out there. And if they're web-based, as wikis are, it's pretty easy to just have a browser up with that, and then you can just throw some information as you need more of it. It's a little bit of a step above your note app, but for me, what I tend to do is, as I said, I start sort of with pencil and paper. I work to a note app. As it gets to something that I'm using multiple times, and it pretty much is now, from the last 3 times I've done it, the steps are almost identical, then I'm going to move it into a wiki. So it becomes a little more set in stone, I guess, even though because it's a wiki, it's not set in stone, but it's going to be definitely much closer to static. Great thing to keep track of is solutions that you've embraced. If there's certain problems you've run into, and you can see that on the Developer website, there are a couple of things that we ran into multiple times that dealt with like EC2, running WordPress on EC2, permissions related, some of the size restrictions and default settings that WordPress has. Those things that we ran into several times, and we found a solution that worked and was worked every time and worked well. And so we ended up throwing it out there on the site. So now if we run into it, it's pretty easy to do a search, find the article, go read through it, walk through the steps, and we're off and running. And this becomes basically, although you can share it with others, this is your personal tech reference. This is the things that you've solved, the things that you've gone through. If you get yourself in a habit of documenting them, preferably the first time, but if not, the second or third time you do it, then any subsequent times, you're going to save yourself looking it up and trying to saying to yourself, what was it I did? How did I get to that point? Because I wanted to get there, but I don't remember how I did. Well, you got your tech reference, you get to do so. You get to figure that out. General documents. I talked about templates, and with those, I'll consider them like quick start documents. So they're not really, we have a lot of stuff out there that's not really a template per se, but we've got a couple of pieces there that help us get going quickly. So, a lot of those status, we may have like a sort of a template that we use for our weekly status or a daily status or a meeting agenda or anything like that. But usually they're a little more than a template. I mean, we're not just plugging in some content. They probably have maybe some additional information like what should be here, or maybe some guidelines about, hey, when you're filling this section, here's some things you should think about. Now, maybe your status doesn't have it, but I think as you get into like maybe design documents, I've seen a lot of those, and it's very helpful that when you've got a design document, quick start template type document, that as it's going through the sections that you want to have, it's got some content there that's not really part of the document. It's notes to yourself or to whoever uses it to say, hey, when you're filling out this, here's some information you should be thinking about, or here's some questions you should be asking yourself. And that's where I say, a quick start is a way to like just jump in and get working on it. And it may look very different from, version to version of it, but at least you've got a good starting point and have captured some best practices and processes at the same time. Great candidates for this are proposals. I've mentioned status several times, research, presentations, actually any kind of presentation, design documents, requirement documents, test documents, all of those kinds of things. Keep them, whether you did it or somebody else did it. That's sort of the bottom line there, because you can learn from others. I personally have got I guess you would call it like a design RFP type document that is, there's probably about 5 or 6 versions of it over the years that each time I took a lot that I learned from watching, looking at what somebody else has done, what I liked out of it, and then, eventually morphed it into my own. And if you go back and look, because I have some of these things, I've got all these old documents, you can sort of see where the influence over the years has gotten me to this thing that I use now. Well, after the first time, and I was at Anderson Consulting. I had somebody that had been doing this for 20 years that I worked on a project, and I had a design document they put together. That was awesome for me when I'm, 2 or 3 years into my career, and I can sit down and somebody says, hey, I need you to, whip up a design document, and I can go look at something that had a lot of thought and a lot of experience that went into it, and use that as my starting point. So now I know what I want to get to. Maybe it's very difficult for me to get to that point, that point of my career. I don't think I couldn't reproduce something to the level of quality that person had, but it at least gave me something to shoot for. And what I ended up producing was far better than I would have had I just tried to remember it or anything like that. It was a huge reference for me. So don't be afraid to, when you're working on projects and you see templates that maybe companies use and things like that, and some of their best practices and processes and procedures that are documented, all that kind of stuff, don't be afraid to, keep those in your repository as well. The middle point there, they do provide history. There's a way you can go back and figure out how you did something, but they're very useful as well to, look at it. How was it done? And maybe make a little bit of improvement every time you use it, tweak it a little bit. Oh, this didn't come out quite the way I wanted, or this doesn't look quite the way I wanted, or this flow doesn't quite work. Make those bit of changes, and eventually what you end up having is something of your own where you've, as I've said, you've sort of stolen from all these great ideas from others, and, turn into something that actually becomes, very high quality. In your document repository, structure, again, very important, and your ability to search, and you may have to put a little effort into this. You may have to maybe name your documents a certain way, or make sure that you have like maybe a requirements folder or a status folder or a presentations folder or something like that, so that you have a little bit of a way to navigate through that stuff. So now moving on to the ultimate is code. Version control. A version control tool of your own is going to be very important for you to understand. Now, yes, when you first start out and pretty much throughout your career, there are going to be some corporate standards. Wherever you go, you hope they already have version control implemented. They've been doing it for a while. It's there. You just come in and you use whatever it is that they use. Every so often there is an opportunity that they've been using something for a long time and they're going to move on to a different tool. You can put hopefully get a little bit of input in there, maybe, help direct them in the future, but that's very rare. More often than not, you're going to walk in and they're going to say, this is what we use. Here's your login. Here's your password. Go use it. That being said, there's a lot of value in having your own personal code repository. It's becoming more often that we see this. GitHub has made it very easy and free to put all kinds of code out there. And a lot of companies now are actually referencing that when you go in for a job interview, as they'll say, hey, can you send us what's your GitHub account? We want to be able to see some of the, some of the public projects that you've done, assuming that you've done a couple. If you haven't, do a couple. Maybe what you do is just like go create, some little app in whatever language is your primary, or the languages that you want to use as part of your job. Go out, write a couple apps. Maybe if it's just a file here, a file there, something really quick and dirty, but skip the dirty part. Keep it quick, but make it clean. Go through and just make it pristine. Every best practice you can think of. Make sure you've got really awesome comments and naming standards of your variables, just all that kind of stuff, and structure within it that somebody looks at it, says, okay, I'm impressed. This person understands their coding. They know how to do it in a way that is professional and not just some hacker or something like that. So have a personal repository. Keep track of code that you've done. There's always going to be ownership issues that you can run into here and there, depending on the company you're at. Someone will say, whatever you write here is only ours. You can never look at it again, and all that kind of stuff. Most of them don't, and most of them that do don't really care, as long as you don't turn around and use it to, for any kind of personal gain, or in a way that it's exposed to anybody else. So, you have to be careful with that. But there's going to be code that you're going to write that is yours, that you can have control over it. You have essentially a license to it. And of course, if you're doing any side hustles or applications or anything like that, then obviously all that code is yours. So put that stuff in your personal repository. Get used to doing things like branching and merging, and understand the command line for whatever that tool is. These things are all what make you better as you get into like a mid-level and senior level developer. When you're junior, you can get away with anything. Just go in, use the tools, you're done. But as you get further along, you're going to want to have a little better idea of why that stuff works that way. How does the more advanced features of your version control tools work? And what are some of the problems you may run into with it? If you've got comparing version controls tools, maybe some do things better than others. Well, if you need to do a recommendation at some point, or if you're at a company that has two different version control tools, things like that may influence how you proceed with it. And all of these just lead to forming some good habits of being a developer. So, make sure when you commit, you put in meaningful commit. Don't just say, change some code or something, or blank, which is probably your worst commit comments. Get yourself in the habit of writing something so that when you go back 6 months later, you can look at your code comments, your commit comments, and figure out what you were actually doing. And, if you look back after a couple months and you can't figure it out, well, start adjusting your habit. Get yourself to the point that you've sort of walked through the idea of, what if I get hit by a bus and somebody looks at my code 6 months from now? Is it going to be even intelligible to them? That kind of stuff is going to help you be able to reuse your code, but it's also going to help you be a better developer to your employers, your customers, your manager, whoever it is that you're trying to impress with your skills. Group communication. This is like a golden age of group communication stuff that's out there. There's so many methods out there to group communicate. And by this, it can be small groups, like a little team, or it can be huge stuff like basically all the social networking sites do. And of course, there's networking sites that aren't really social networking sites. They are, but they have a more narrow focus. Back in the day, they were like bulletin board systems and message boards. Sometimes they're still called that, but sometimes they are a social site of some sort or another. Out of the tools that are out there, I would get used to play around with all of them. Find the ones, one, that work with your company, two, that you're comfortable with, and three, that at the very least that your friends and coworkers and associates are comfortable with. Great example of that kind of relationship is Michael, who's listening, intently here, or not. Maybe he's asleep by now. And I, over the years, we've worked together different times, and then we've actually worked on projects, and then at times we've been working on completely different stuff. But we still tend to have sort of a regular rapport where, if he runs into something that he's struggling with, or I run into something I'm struggling with, or we stumble on something that's a really cool approach or, bit of news or something like that, then we'll communicate. And we could, use text messages, and sometimes we do, but there's other ways to do that. And, we work through several of these. And then, of course, the teams that I've been on in the past also influence those, because if you've got 20 or 30 people that you've worked with in the past that are all on one tool, it makes it easy, just be on that tool as well. Slack is becoming hugely popular. There's all kinds of Slack channels out there. It's easy to get on it. It's easy to monitor multiple channels. It's easy to see what's going on. It has its limits. I mean, if you get on a very popular, very verbose Slack channel, it can be very hard to keep track of what's going on, especially if you only check in every like every hour or two. You may suddenly have 100 messages that you have to dig through, and that's a little tough. But it's still an awesome tool, and it's got channels and things like that make it easy to use. Instant messenger type apps, or like Adium, and there's Trillion and a bunch of these that they're like aggregator apps that allow you to have one app up but see a whole bunch of different instant messenger type channels, whether it's maybe Google Talk or Yahoo if they still have theirs, or Microsoft, the MSN if that still exists. Some of those things they're slowly dying here and there, but there's also still a bunch of them out there. So it's nice to have a tool that allows you to just see whatever, so you can monitor a whole bunch of different places at once. Message boards, these could be internal, external. They, like I said, they may be considered like a social networking type site. Internally, a lot of times if you're in a bigger company, there'll be an intranet that has some internal message boards of some sort that you can do some communication with, that you probably need to monitor so you can see what's going on. As I mentioned, text and SMS, everybody just feels like has a smartphone these days. Most companies, even if as you're starting out, I think if you don't have a smartphone, they'll probably, they'll have a way to get you one or comp you one or something like that. So it tends to be pretty easy to contact people that way. Group is a little tougher. That's more of a, one-to-one, but there are some, you can have text groups and SMS groups as well. Not a bad thing to do. And then, of course, there's like your conferencing related apps like Chime, which we're using, GoToMeeting, Google Groups. There's just a whole lot of stuff out there as well, which are, depending on what you want to do, they can be very valuable. In particular, those are awesome. One, if you want to record a session, which I have found more and more is very valuable, because then I can go back and say, what did he actually say? Because I'm not, I'm trying to do what he told me to do, and it's not working right. So you can go back and watch it. Also screen sharing. So if you're trying to debug something, or you're trying to track why somebody's running into an issue and you're not right there next to them, awesome for that. Mail. We get email out the wazoo almost immediately. I mean, once you're a year or two into this, you're going to have you get email all the time. Some of it's useful. A lot of it probably isn't. It helps to have, though, a sort of like a master or a mail client that you're comfortable with, that you can almost always work with, and that you have ideally a way to import export, so that even if your company uses a different mail system, there's a way to export that out and then pull it into your own mail repository. Preferably cross-platform. That makes it nice. So if you're in a place where you're stuck using a Windows machine or a Mac machine or Linux desktop or something like that, then you can still use your mail client and be able to track mail and even answer mail throughout your day from the various sources. With that, like I said, you want to be able to import, export, and back up. Ideally, work your mailbox on a regular enough basis. That whole idea of inbox zero, try to get it so that you use filters and rules and the tools that a good mail client will have, so that you can work the things that you need to work, and you can file the things that need to be filed. And for the things that are filed, there should be a way to, search back through them, or they're organized in a way that you can fairly easily get to them. Gmail, if you want a good web-based, browser-based client, Gmail stuff works really well, and it does allow you to hook it up to a whole bunch of different accounts, so you could run it through the browser if you like. There are some issues with it, particularly if you can't use Chrome, because Chrome is by far the best for the Gmail client, but most of the others are not that far off, other than a few of the drag and drop things and things like that. And of course, the problem with Gmail, eventually you'll hit the whatever it's up to 10 gigabyte limit, and maybe you'll have to pay. But hey, if it's free for 10 years until you generate 10 gigabytes of mail, then hey, at least you got it free for 10 years. And 10 years in a career, you should be able to pay whatever their fee is, $20 a month, or I don't even know what it is, but I don't think it's nothing that's going to kill you anyways. And who knows, by the time you get to that point, they'll probably have expanded it to 16 terabytes, so you won't have to worry about it. But learn how to use your client, whether you're just going to go with the default that your company gives you. They all use Outlook, and so you're going to use Outlook. That's fine, but at the very least, understand how to use filters and rules and automation within that tool. It's going to help your productivity a lot, because if you have to dig through email, it's just slow, tedious, and generally time consuming. Keep everything. Email, it's too often that you run into something where you need access to an email, and you sent it, or somebody sent it to you and you just can't find it, probably because you just deleted it. Don't do that. Keep track of everything. I do it, and it's sometimes a pain because I now have huge folders of mails that go back 15 or 20 years, but I occasionally do need something on an email that I sent 20 years ago. So literally almost 20 years ago. So, keep it all. It's just space at the end of the day, and it's not a lot. So, hold on to those things, in particular the things you've sent, because you may find out that, 3 years ago, there's that person I was talking to and nothing really came of that conversation, but now suddenly I really do want to go back to talk to them. And that's an example I can use, because I've had situations where I had potential jobs or projects that I was going to work on, and those people dropped off the face of the earth. And then for some reason, I ended up needing to contact them a couple of years later, and suddenly the project came back to life, and we were off and running again. So do that and keep it, but also have an archive strategy of some sort, particularly sent emails. For me, what I'll do is I'll just archive them off after, and every so often I go back and everything that I sent more than 2 months prior, just take it all, export it out so I can remove some space and then archive it off. And that way, if I have to, I can always dig back into the archive, but it's not bogging down my system generally. With email, you may get attachments. Actually, you probably almost definitely will get attachments. Keeping attachments with the email can be important, but honestly, you're far better off when you get attachments that have any value whatsoever, which is not including the company logos and crap like that occasionally come as attachments. Just save them off and store them in your document repository. That is a far better way to deal with it, because if you try to, with email attachments, if you get an upgrade, it may suddenly break all of your links to your attachments, or maybe you're cleaning up some files somewhere and you accidentally delete all your attachments and now you've got broken links. Just make sure that if it's a valuable document, store it as such. Don't store it as an attachment off of something else. Database tools and integrated development environments from a database point of view. Whatever your database is, that's your primary database, whether it's an Oracle or MySQL or Microsoft SQL Server or Postgres, whatever, you name it, they're going to have some native tools. And honestly, most of the modern databases have some pretty good native tools. They've got some stuff that allow you to wheel and deal in that database, do administrative tasks, you name it. They probably allow you to do it. So learn how to use those. Those are going to make you, better with that environment. Whatever scripts and queries that you work on, keep track of those. That's sort of the idea of keeping notes and keeping sort of a journal of what you've done. database scripts and queries are more valuable than just about anything else that I've run into. I mean, other than source code itself, which is funny enough because they basically are, I mean, they're source code. They're source code for dealing with the database. Queries in particular, if you have to solve a problem where you've got some really nasty, multi-table join with a whole bunch of inner selects and maybe some unions and a couple other things thrown in there, if you have to spend some time figuring out how to make that query work, save it, because sooner or later you're probably going to run into that problem again, and you'll be thanking yourself that that you do have that in an easy way to find how you solved it the first time around. With those, keep some reference links with them as well. There may be like a how-to for TSQL or PLSQL or things like that. You should have with any of your tools. They're probably going to have some really good links or some ways to keep track of those, so do so. There's not really, I use the term IDE, but that's really sort of some more, more full-featured database tools, and also really more specifically database tools that are not specific to a database engine. So a database tool that can work with MySQL and Oracle and MySQL Server and Postgres and Mongo or whatever else, that tools that are essentially cross database platform tools. These are even more valuable to me, I think, than the native tools. If you're in an environment where you only ever work on this one database engine type and you're never going to worry about anything else, fine, learn the native tools. You're going to be awesome. You'll be off and running. If there's any situation where you may have to use multiple database engines, maybe even if it's SQL Server, but you also have to use Access, and it's sort of a pain to get the Access database into SQL Server, things like that, find a good cross-platform tool. And cross-platform in both ways, that the application itself ideally would be cross-platform, so you can access your database whether you're having to run it on a X Windows or Mac or Windows or whatever it's running on, as well as being able to point to different database engines. The better database IDEs, they're going to cost a little bit of money, and it's going to cost you some time to get comfortable with them and learn how to use them and really become productive in them. But that is a good investment. Just trust me, if you spend any real time in databases, if you're not just a pure coder type developer, if you have to spend any time in databases, getting a good tool is going to pay for itself quickly, especially if you understand how to use that well. When you're looking for a good IDE, and there's, again, several out there, don't overlook the ER design features and query generation tools that are out there. They used to be very clunky and error prone. It's gotten to the point where they're actually very powerful, very useful. They can actually even help you with performance tuning and things of that nature. Along with that, usually your good IDE is going to have a pretty full-featured integration with the database. It's going to be able to do things like drop and create tables, deal with indexes, deal with triggers, deal with stored procedures, deal with functions, all of those kinds of things that you need to use if you're dealing with the database. A lot of them now, or some of them at least now, have the ability to generate some sort of code around a database structure. So maybe they can point you can point it to a database, and it'll generate like maybe like an Oracle Forms form or a Java form or an HTML form or something like that. That's they're not going to be perfect, but at least it gets your code started based on that. There's a lot of object relational mapping tools, which are much more common, where it'll generate some code for you that gives you it's going to be ugly, but raw code to integrate with your database. You may have to build a little bit extra configuration around it, but it saves you some typing. Most of them are going to have some really good import-export ETL type features that allow you to wheel and deal with your database, move from one database to another, back it up, restore it, all that kind of good stuff. Take advantage of it. A lot of them now, the IDEs have got some really powerful tuning and query options that are there. It's the show plan stuff that you can get out of SQL Server. Toad is a long time Oracle tool, but now is a cross-platform. It works in a whole bunch of different environments, and it has some really good tools for figuring out what your query is doing, what indexes it's using, where the bottlenecks are in your queries. There's a lot of tools like that, and they may not be that big a deal if you're just writing some queries and trying to crank out some code. But if you ever get a situation where you're having to maintain a real application, you've got some in production, you've got a lot of users, you've got the potential for maybe scalability and speed issues, these tools are worth their weight in gold, or probably something even more valuable than gold. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if you're just a pure developer, coder type, you can probably avoid these things. But if you do especially if you do heavy database work, or even regular database work, definitely if you're a DBA of some sort, then you definitely get yourself a really good database ID. It will be worth itself. Just like working with general code, a regular ID is going to really help you be a better developer. Some final thoughts on this. Build your own toolbox, master your tools. If there's one thing that I think it's useful for you to walk away, if you probably already have it. If you've been a developer even 5, 6, 7 years or more, you've got some sort of a toolbox. Probably not necessarily complete. As you get further into your career, you probably have enough tools that you've run into that you've got your we'll call them your primary tools that you use maybe daily, but probably at least once a week, once a month. And then you've got sort of some secondary, tertiary tools that you maybe only use once in a blue moon, but at least you use them, you know how to use them, you're comfortable with them. The more tools in your toolbox, the more valuable you're going to be to your employer and actually to yourself, that you're going to be that much more productive, because you're going to have a comfort zone of, I know this tool, I know how to use it, and I don't have to learn it. I don't have to ramp up to it. If I have a situation where it becomes this tool is the right tool for that problem, bam, I'm off and running. It is worth it in a lot of cases, like some of these note-taking, issue tracking, even some of the version control, things like that. There's some work that I've referred to that would be sort of duplication of effort, or maybe even duplicate entry, where you're, like for a ticket, maybe you've got your own little tracking tool, but you've also got one that your company or your client uses. Sometimes there is a value in you double entering that stuff, because you have something that you can control, that you can feed all your information into, and maybe or maybe not, other people can utilize it, but it makes you a better user, or a better employee, a better developer, or whatever it is that you happen to be working with. So don't just automatically throw it out, throw an idea out because you say, oh, well, this would require me to do a little bit of extra effort. Take a look at it, because sometimes that extra effort actually is an investment that gets paid for. With these tools, you're going to probably get more value out of them, and it's going to be easier to pick the tools that work best or work more like you do as you move into areas of like self-employment or consulting, or like high-level decision point, management within a company. Early on, it's a little hard to do this. You're going to be sort of spoon-fed a lot of this, or force-fed a lot of this. But as you get further on, it does allow you, there is the freedom to pick the tool that works best with you. And honestly, it makes work a lot less work, makes it a little more enjoyable. So at this point, I'll open up any questions, comments, suggestions so far.
I had one thing I'd like to point out when you were talking about the source control and committing your code as you go. One of the things I've experienced over the years, especially on larger projects, if you're not careful when you do your commits, you'll find out that when you basically at the end of a sprint, or if you wait a couple of days before you commit your code, you're going to have a lot of different changes in a particular ticket or multiple tickets that you're working on. So if you're using things like Git or Subversion, one of the nice things you can do is to actually create a branch for each issue that you're working on, so you can keep them separate. And then when you make your commits for those, you can then merge them into the larger ticket before you push them back up to the hub or up to the head.
Yeah, and that's even good. even when you're just working your own little thing, particularly if you work off of multiple machines. I've run into that several times where I've got projects that I'm working on, and I'll write some code on one machine, and then I'll write some code on another machine. And sometimes I'm actually essentially I'm really working different tickets. I'm working in different areas because, like the one I'm working on whatever my main trunk of ideas and tasks is, but maybe on the other machine, it's because either something occurred to me, or maybe I'm working on it for a customer that they throw something out there. It's like, oh, I've got to, or I run into a bug where it's like, oh, I've got to do a quick fix or something like that. It's a good habit to get into. Just if you're going to do some work, actually the first thing is make sure that you actually, refresh the repository or whatever to make sure that you have the latest code. But the other thing is if you're going to go off and do something, just create a quick branch, which Git is awesome for that. And then you can go make your changes, and then, you can even do some commits along the way. And as Michael said, merging can be huge. And so if you can do smaller merge chunks, it's going to make the whole process go a lot easier. And this is, Michael says that, and I know that we had some situations back. I can't remember which place we were at, but one of our former lives where we worked together as developers, I can remember sometimes that we had a lot of coding going on, and Michael having to spend a lot of time in merges because people didn't have those. That small approach to making changes. They'd go dump, 3 or 4 days worth of coding in a single commit, and then you got to figure out a way how to work through all of that stuff. And of course, if you get asked, if you've done that, and then somebody asks you, well, what was in there? It's really difficult to even go back to your own code and pick and choose your way through what you changed and how you changed it. Particularly if there's like things like formatting or something like that, suddenly throws off all the automated change detection devices.
Yeah, it was actually back when we were dealing with the CVS, which hell. That was back in the day before we had Git and Subversion, and it was a real pain.
Other questions, suggestions, thoughts?
None for me.
All right. Well, general silence in that. Was this useful to everybody? Is this something you got at least something out of it?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought it was a pretty good overview. I mean, there's a lot of areas where you can now we could either branch off and spin off to individual discussions.
Yeah, I think you could easily, almost any one of those could become a pretty full-blown discussion itself, particularly if you look at, and some of them have come from requests that have been made to me of evaluating tools of a certain type. And once you start looking at like free versus paid, small team versus large team, open source versus not, you could easily spend, you could have a pretty good discussion of easily a half hour to an hour on some of these things and how to use them. What are some great tools out there? What's the pros and cons? So yeah, that's it. I guess it does serve as a really nice overview type of presentation. So cool. So in wrapping it up finally, look, developers need tools for more than writing code. So don't forget that. There's a lot of good stuff out there. Regular random Google searches for tools of random types actually you'd be amazed at what you can find. I used to recommend SourceForge a lot. I haven't been out there in a while, but SourceForge, the Apache projects, however many hundreds they have now, actually even Amazon's AWS, I don't know, maybe I think I'm getting further behind. I think I'm now I think at one point I was probably 20% through their services. I think I'm now back down to like 10%. But there's a lot of stuff out there. There's new stuff all the time. So it's worth it to regularly just do sort of see what's out there. If there's something that you're doing, a task you're doing that you're like, man, there's got to be a better way. Google it, and you may find out that there is actually a better way, and somebody already put together something, and hey, maybe it's even free. That being said, sometimes there's going to be an investment required. Maybe there's going to be a little bit of money you're going to have to pay. You may have to go in and spend a little time in a trial period to figure it out. Most of them, though, unless the tool really sucks, which usually you can figure that out pretty quickly, it does pay off. And the bottom line, there's just a lot of tools and options out there. Every time I go back and look at some of these things, there's 5 more tools that are pretty dang impressive and worth spending some time looking at them. As always, big thanks. Appreciate your time. Appreciate that you guys have walked through this with me. If anything comes to you afterwards, as always, there's 1,000 different ways you can get it to us. It feels like you can get us at info@developernoir.com on email. Hit this up with the contact form, which just recently got repaired for some reason. It had been broken. Thank you, MailChimp, or some WordPress MailChimp integration that broke that for a while. Twitter out on @Developernoir. Got it out there on the Facebook site, getting a little bit of traffic there, and always happy to have any conversations there. And of course, anytime you're here at the mentor class, the mastermind group, however you want to approach it, there's always some good stuff out here, and we're always happy to randomly discuss whatever questions come up. So at the end of the day, as always, trying to make everybody a little bit better as a developer. And if we can do that, then hopefully there'll be a few less bugs in the world. Have a good one.